And Russia has called for a meeting of the UN Security Council over the poisoning. And these are pictures from the UN Security Council meeting. Russia requested the meeting because it says it shared the principle that the use of chemical weapons anywhere was unacceptable and that it should be investigated and its perpetrators punished. The Russian envoy to the UN is speaking, so let's listen in.
Laboratory important down stated on Tuesday that his laboratory has determined that this was a toxic nerve substance, but it could not confirm its origin. That was a quote. Furthermore, he said that no antidotes were introduced into the Skripals. He assumed that the British government, unlike him, may have additional information on this topic. Now, we have to pay tribute to Mr. Aikenhead. He did not put in danger his professional reputation to service the guesswork or the versions put forward by the British authorities. At the same time, he assured everyone that nothing of the kind, no substance of the kind, could have left the premises of his laboratory. So the question is, what was this that couldn't leave the premises of the laboratory? And does the OPCW know about this substance? Now, no matter what happens, all this means that the main argument of the British side about the unquestionable Russian origin of the substance has basically is no longer valid. Now, all the system of evidence about the highly likely version of the involvement of Russia was based on that premise. But that statement by Mr. Aikenhead only adds even more questions into this case that is before us. Once again, we want to state urbi et orbi. Novichok is not copyrighted by Russia, in spite of the obviously Russian name. It is a name that was invented in the West for a line of toxic substances, which is nothing new for experts and scientists, were developed in many countries, including in the United States and in Great Britain. Boris Johnson, in response to a direct question of Deutsche Welle, directly confirmed that Great Britain does have samples of that substance in Portendown. Yesterday, on the site of British Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the tweet about the Russian origin of the substance was deleted. This already led to some scandals and some serious talk behind the scenes. However, Boris Johnson and the British Foreign Service immediately got extra support and assistance from the British Special Services, just like Chippendale, which using the Times newspaper yesterday stated that they were able to, on the basis of a scientific analysis and intelligence data, determine the probable origin of the substance already a few days after the chemical attack in Salisbury. It is stated that on the 7th of March, the Cabinet of Ministers knew that the chemical substance was produced in Russia with a very high degree of probability. Now, the British intelligence service consider that they have determined the location of a secret Russian laboratory where the nerve agent was produced. And furthermore, be very attentive to what I'm about to say, the sources of the British intelligence services cannot speak openly about the location of the laboratory. However, their knowledge of where it's located, their certainty of where it's located is very high. Their degree of certainty. They also consider that the Russian side conducted tests to determine whether Novichok could be used for politically motivated murders or assassinations. There's even more. The Daily Mail also yesterday revealed that British intelligence services have highly secret information from certain sources about the fact that Russia, it turns out, just before the attack in Salisbury, tested the nerve agent Novichok on everyday targets, or like a door handle, for example, or everyday objects. Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, I don't even know what to say about this. It's some sort of theater of the absurd. Couldn't you come up with a better fake story? I mean, we all know what the worth of British intelligence information is based on the experience with Tony Blair. We have told our British colleagues that you're playing with fire and you'll be sorry. Because it's one thing to put forward unsubstantiated accusations, and it's quite different to start speaking using professional terms, which means not simply who will speak loudest in diplomacy, but it requires clear answers to very specific, substantial questions. I don't think that the British investigative bodies are grateful to the British government for their hasty and unequivocal statements and conclusions. All this, of course, your politicians never thought about all this, did they? They had no idea that their hyped-up statements might boomerang and hit them. They used a very useful and timely anti-Russian canard. The topic, Russian chemical attack, so-called. Of course, they weren't aware that once the dust settles, they will be held responsible for their words. And yet, London started poisoning our relations with other countries. As a sign of solidarity, out of a number of states that are allies of the United Kingdom, some 150 Russian diplomats were expelled. We know that your ambassadors around the world are putting pressure on sovereign states and are forcing them to follow this very terrible example. You started a wave that even reached New York. Your allies in the United States have undertaken an unprecedented expulsion of 60 Russian diplomats, including 12 staff members of the permanent mission of Russia with the UN, without providing any proof for this, without conducting consultations with us as provided for in the agreement on headquarters, presence at headquarters, and hence they clearly didn't comply with all the provisions of the headquarters agreement of the United Nations, and lived up to their obligations. And by the way, it's not the first time that the United States has not lived up to their obligations in this area. Now, also, the United States forced Russia to give up its diplomatic property. The United States forced Russia to give up its diplomatic property. The United States seized from Russia diplomatic property that belonged to it, including Russian property here in the permanent mission at the United Nations in New York. They established a 25-mile zone for our diplomats, a restricted zone. They're not extending and they're not issuing them American visas. We call on the United States to be responsible vis-à-vis their responsibilities as a host country and to return everything that they illegitimately took from us and refrain from similar steps in the future. Mr. President, we are witnessing truly remarkable events. This new approach in law, I already mentioned this, where you have accusations based on simply without any proof, I already mentioned this at the meeting of the 14th of March, simply on the basis of suspicions. However, no less surprising is something else. When I look at the debates, interviews, and statements of British politicians, I'm simply stunned. O tempora o mores. What happened to good old England? Is this a lack of professionalism or a deterioration of political culture? Or is this exactly the kind of new political culture we're seeing? I really don't have an answer. I perhaps will allow those present here to draw their own conclusions. The British authorities are trying to almost make fun of Russia by providing some 30 versions of what has happened. Now, you should note that these are not versions of the Russian provided by the Russian authority. These are opinions by experts and journalists. It's true that there are many versions because there's not enough facts or evidence. Whereas in Russia, everyone here wants to get to the bottom of this dark story. But the British authorities, in fact, don't have a lot of versions. Or rather, they have just one version, and which they have put forward as a verdict at a trial. And at the same time, they can't determine, they can't come to grips, they can't determine what the source of the toxic substance is. Is it the house of Mr. Skripal, the doorknob? Is it flowers, buckwheat grain, or laurel? Now, we have to acknowledge that the citizens and experts from Great Britain and from other countries, those who are capable of thinking, also have come up with a whole range of different versions. And there are many questions to which they don't have answers. Here are just a few of the questions. Where were the Skripals for 4 hours with their telephones switched off? How were the samples taken? Who can confirm their reliability? Why weren't relatives asked for their approval to take blood samples? How did the antidote against an unknown chemical substance appear so quickly? And was it injected into the Skripals? What was Skripal doing? Who was he communicating with? Where did he go? Where was he traveling? Who was he talking to? Did they meet with anyone on the day of the event, or on the eve, or the day before? Where are the data from the video surveillance cameras? Now, how are these accusations put forward in haste? How do they correspond, or how do they gel with the statements by the Scotland Yard that they will require several weeks or maybe months of investigative work? Why is Russia not being given consular access to Russian citizens against whom on the territory of Great Britain possibly a terrorist act was carried out? The British authorities decided quickly that their insinuations without evidence will not cost them at all. Believe me, my friends, this story and this investigation is far from being over. In fact, it hasn't even begun. On the 12th of March, we sent to the Foreign Office a note with a request to provide us access to the data from the investigation, including the samples of the chemical substance that the British investigation was referring to, for our experts to examine it in the framework of a joint investigation. This way, we were acting in the framework of Article 2 of Paragraph 2 of Article 9 of the Convention on Chemical Weapons. According to that convention, member states can on the basis of an exchange of information and consultations on a bilateral basis, resolve any issue that could cause any doubts regarding the compliance with this treaty. Now, based on the provisions of that article, Russia would be ready to respond to a request by Great Britain within 10 days. Instead of all this, London put forward a completely absurd 24-hour ultimatum. Obviously, we rejected it. No one and under no circumstances can talk in this way or using this tone with Russia. And this ultimatum, which was transmitted to Boris Johnson orally to the Russian ambassador in London, the Foreign Secretary made clear
that there are only two possible scenarios. Either the Russian state has attempted murder on the British soil using a chemical weapon, or Russia lost control.
Okay, you've been listening to a UN Security Council meeting on the alleged nerve agent attack in Britain, and this is something that Russia requested to the United Nations Security Council to meet to discuss British accusations that Moscow used a nerve agent to attack a former Russian spy in England last month. And the words have been extremely harsh. We've heard the Russian UN envoy telling the Security Council that the nerve agent attack, we've told our British colleagues that you're playing with fire and you'll be sorry.